Hey, Dewan.
Hey.
You see our friends in the chat. Yes.
Yes.
Pachina and Katie. Last week we had an amazing time, right? It was an adventure for us, our first time really trying to do this work this way, and the encouragement and the support we really appreciate, and got lots of positive feedback that it was a wonderful and rich experience for y'all. So we are back for week 2 and excited that a lot of you are back. And we welcome those of you who may not have been able to join us last week, but are here for our second week. And so we hope that you had a chance to take a look at this week's pre-work, which included videos from our storytellers, Lorena, Estrella, and Nicole Matthews. Also, the pre-work included some opportunities to really look at implicit bias and how we are single-storied and how we might be single-storying others. So welcome, everybody. Welcome, Karen and Lisa, Aisha and Jackie, and everybody from Austin, Texas.
Yes.
Yvonne from St. Augustine. It's really exciting to be with you all. So we'll give you a chance to log in and set up. Wonderful. Great. So part of why Rachel and I came together to explore how we might have these conversations at a larger scale was really around what are the practices that people could engage in to be able to have really healthy conversations, but also apply racial equity to their work. And so the setup of this learning community is not so much about the content of whether or not we're negotiating if racism is an issue. It's really about the practices. What does it mean, as we talked about last week, to locate ourselves, to really be grounded in our own stories, to have a sense of what parts of our stories we have access to, which parts we don't, what parts we want to explore more. And then this week, we're going to be talking about how do we get beyond those single stories, the ways in which we have all been stereotyped or narrowed. And those stories actually show up in our policies and our programs. So that's the conversation we want to have today. And we're excited because we know that many of you are also doing this work with colleagues, friends, your community members, your chosen family. So it's not just people here who are logged on individually, but we've gotten word that whole staffs and departments and teams and people are working together, which is the way we're going to get free, y'all. We're going to get free by doing it together. That liberation is not an individualized experience. And then just to kind of reemphasize that for us, we see liberation as a practice. That it's not just a destiny, as I said before, that we'll get free in 47 years. No, we are working towards liberation, and we want to be liberated and have joyful, connected, authentic, healing experiences while we're doing that. So that's what we're up to today.
Yeah.
Hey, Rachel, anything you want to add?
Yeah, the only thing to add is just a reminder for some of you, you may just be joining us for the first time this week, and so welcome. And just a reminder that this is not necessarily a course on defining racism, but how we will look at these practices through a lens of understanding racial equity. And so just excited to be here with you all, and we're going to dive right in. And you should know who we are. And so, of course, many of you have already heard some of our stories, whether you watched the video. And also last week, we shared a little bit about ourselves. And we're going to continue to build on that understanding of who we are, even as facilitators and trainers and organizers. And so my name is Rachael Marie Ibrahim, and I use the pronouns she, her, and hers. I identify as a social work community organizer, an activist, an equity trainer, racial equity and liberation trainer. I also identify as a mixed race, Black, cis woman who was raised in the Midwest with largely white communities. I also identify as an artist, something I've rediscovered in more recent years, and that actually has always been with me since I was very young. And the experience of growing up in largely white communities, even though my father is Nigerian, and I grew up in the U.S., and I always had a connection to the arts. It wasn't necessarily something that was in our family, but it was something that was innate in me. And one of the things that I learned in my experiences is, one, in my family, talking about race and racism wasn't necessarily a conversation that was easy to engage, especially being the only person who looked like me in my family, but also what the conversations would be around the expectations because of my race. And so the expectation was that I could be an artist, that I was supposed to be an artist, that it was an expectation that I could sing and dance. And even though I can, it was the expectation that was the burden. And so thinking about the single stories that were created around my artistry, that has informed some of the fears around performing, was because art was performance-based, not necessarily culturally based. It wasn't necessarily spiritual or healing. It was around performance. And so, and also performing with largely white audiences shaped how I experienced that art. And so I bring that part of my story to today's conversation.
Again, I'm Monica Dennis. My pronouns are she and her. I identify as a Black woman whose people have been here for many, many generations, at least 7 generations that we have the actual history of. So I really identify as an African in America, a person whose people are from the South, even though I was born and raised in the South Bronx of New York, which has its own dynamic, which I really affirm. That really shapes how I see myself and how I approach organizing. I'm also a dancer. I also see myself as a healer. My work is to bring healing to just social justice spaces. And Rachael, when you were talking, I was thinking about making connections between single stories and what you were talking about, what you were expected to be. I'm thinking about what I was not expected to be. So I grew up in the South Bronx, which is a Black and Latino community, also wanting to acknowledge that you can be Black and Latinx at the same time. And that's another, we can get into that a little bit later about the single stories we have about who's who. And in that community, the way I was educated, I was really affirmed that I could be, like, my gifts and talents were actually affirmed in the educational setting. It was a community-run educational process. So my gifts around math and science were affirmed. My artistry was affirmed. Being a girl was affirmed, like a smart girl was affirmed. And it wasn't until I had to go to middle school and my family made the choice and had the opportunity and privilege to, through different programs, to send me to a predominantly white private schools, was when the narrowing actually started, right? So there was no expectation that as a Black girl, I would actually have some deep skills in math and science. There was always, I wasn't expected to actually be able, when I was writing my papers about what was happening in Central America, there was no expectation. There was always questioning, like, how do you know this about what's happening in El Salvador and Nicaragua? Because I live in a community with Salvadorians and Nicaraguans, right? So there was no sense of who I was outside of being a scholarship student who was awarded an opportunity to come to this school and to be grateful. It doesn't mean I didn't get a solid education in many ways, but also I think about this single story about who I was didn't actually allow that educational system to develop me more. And so all of the ways I had to kind of compartmentalize as a student, work harder, overcompensate just to prove my worth, is also why I come to this work. It's not just, as you're saying, it's not a separate experience. I'm working on myself. I'm in community healing spaces to kind of undo some of these single stories that we've been told.
That's right.
Yeah.
And we're going to keep telling these stories, and really excited to bring in Lorena and Nicole to share a little introduction about who you are, and excited that you're going to expand on your stories more later. So if you could just take a minute or two and just share your name, your pronouns, some of the intersections that you live in, and a snapshot of who your people are in the work that you do. So Lorena, can you kick us off?
Awesome. Well, thank you all. Bienvenidos a todos. So I'm Lorena Estrella, and I'm here with Sadie Nash Leadership Project. And so I identify as Dominicana, Afro-Latina, first generation, born to immigrant parents who immigrated to Northern Jersey in the late 1980s. And I'm very much similar to Monica in the way that I was identified really early as a scholar and a good student, and that meant that my educational trajectory looked a lot different from those that I grew up with. So I grew up in a working class neighborhood amongst a lot of other immigrants, first generation kids, and when I got to middle school and high school, I started, my education looked very different. So I was around a lot of my white peers, and I think that's when I started to feel different. Everyone didn't look like me. And just sort of slowly started to feel really ashamed and embarrassed of where I came from and those working class roots, my cultural history. I started to really separate and compartmentalize as well so that I could fit in and sort of assimilate and really perfecting English, right? And even that's not my first language, but having to really step into perfecting what this idea of whiteness meant for me. And so it was a really interesting educational experience. And the work that I do now is really about creating spaces for young women of color who come from similar backgrounds to really see themselves and their histories as sources of strength and really elevate their leadership and their voice so that they feel like they are valued in this society and don't have to leave their communities to understand their worth and belonging. So I'll pause there and really excited to be here. And, you know, I think storytelling is something that the more I talk and engage with community, I learn about myself. So I'm excited to have this conversation today and continue to unpack all the different stories that I've learned and have had to unlearn, right, about what it means to step into Afro-Latinidad and occupy sort of brown skin and family with different skin complexions and living in New York and New Jersey and what that means the more I travel in the country, sort of trying to understand all those stories and how they come together.
That's right. Beautiful. Thank you so much, Lorena. Welcome. Nicole, could you share a little bit about yourself as well?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Hello, everyone. Mani Dubaneshi Kwe Indigenous Cause, Migisi Dodame. I'm Nicole Matthews. My Indian name is Spirit Bird Woman. I'm an Anishinaabe from the White Earth Reservation in northern Minnesota, although my family has always lived on the Leech Lake Reservation, and so there's a big story of relocation behind why that all is so. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a mother. I'm a new grandmother. I have a 3-day-old grandson, just born on Tuesday, and I'm the executive director at the Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition. And so some of the intersections I live at is, you know, I grew up in an urban area. So while I also had connections to our tribal communities, there is something about being an urban Indian and what that means and what our connection or disconnection to our cultural identities and how that informed and shaped me growing up. And so, you know, I'm the daughter of a mother who moved off the reservation the day after she turned 18 because she wanted something better for her, and she wanted something better for, you know, for her children and her family, and that was lovely, and it was great, and also can be a disconnect too for, you know, keeping us connected to our cultural identity. And so also that with also being very light-skinned, and people really defining for me who I am, and whether or not I fit into one cultural community or another. I am also Chinese, and I am also white, and so I carry all of those identities with me, and I think, you know, it's been a struggle for me, and also, you know, how people identify me and how I also have single storied myself. So I'm really happy to be a part of this conversation.
Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thanks so much, y'all.
Yes, thank you. And you've already started to do it beautifully, and we're going to, you know, continue to share, like, what are those single stories and the impacts. And so, you know, just to go over our agenda for today, we're going to do some grounding and acknowledgement. We're going to review our community agreements. We're going to frame the conversation around what are single stories and what are the impacts, and, you know, have that give examples of what that actually looks like in our lived experiences with our panelists in our conversation, and take questions from you all, our viewers, folks who are watching today, so you can be a part of the conversation as well, and then we'll close together. Yeah. So
just as we get ready to do our grounding, wanted to also mention, if you're in the chat and you want other attendees to see your responses, you can actually choose who your chat statements go to. So you can choose all panelists and attendees, or you can send something to us directly as panelists. And then also we're asking, if you are on social media, to use the hashtag real communities, like racial equity and liberation communities, hashtag real communities. All right.
Wonderful. So let's get grounded. As you know, we said on our first session together, grinding. Whole different conversation. Very different.
Grounding can be grounding.
It can be. And there you have it. Live, everybody. Live. That's what happens. So grounding really is what we're going to do. I'm going to ask if you're in private, you can do grinding. But for public purposes, for grounding, what we're going to do is really connect to self, purpose, be mindful of our thoughts and the energy in which we bring to anything, right? When we really want to do something well and connected with others, how do we ground ourselves in order to do that in the best ways possible, in the healthiest ways possible? And one of the ways to do that, one practice, is to ground. And so last week we did some breathing, right? And this week we're going to try a different practice. So I'm going to ask you to just take a few seconds and grab a piece of paper and something to write with. So just going to give everyone a moment, whether it's a sticky note, a scrap piece of paper, a napkin, it's all good. Find something that you can write on and write with. And then once you have that, going to ask you to, whether you're standing or sitting, just pause. Just pause. So we're going to have about 30 seconds of silence. And so in that silence, hopefully you became connected with your heartbeat, with how you're breathing. You may have noticed some sensations. And also we notice the things that pull our attention away when we're trying to be present. And so I'm going to ask you to just take, again, it's not a lot of time, it's just a short 30 seconds, to take note of the things that are pulling at your attention. They may be very important things, and some of them may not be important, but, right? And it could be anything from a thought, a to-do list, it could be a person, responsibilities, it could be a task that's unfinished, it could be the laundry, it could be so many things. So just take a moment and write down all the things that are pulling your attention away from this present moment. You might need 5 minutes to write that full list, and you can continue to write that list. And we're also going to present, what is it that you would need in order to show up fully for the next 40 minutes? Right? Whether it's the silencing of the inner chatter, whether it's closing your door, whether it's asking for help, right? Thinking of all the things, maybe it's a cup of coffee, whatever it's going to be. Take note. You might not get these needs met right now, but even just taking note of what it would take in order for you to be fully present for the next 40 minutes. So do that now. Again, you could probably use more time to identify all the things that help you to be present, but it's just, all we've done is taken 2 minutes out of our entire day to just pause and connect. And this practice is really important because racism is always explicitly trying to destabilize us in so many ways. And where can we pause to reground ourselves so that way we are not pulled in just any direction. We're not pulled into just any conversation, but that we show up fully present for the conversations that we need to be having. So thank you all for taking this time.
As part of our practice, any liberatory practice that we do, attribution and acknowledgement is crucial. Part of what's happening to so many of us is that our heroes and sheroes and champions, their stories get lost. And so we find ourselves in times where we don't know, how did we get here, or how do we find our way? And so it's so important to not only share their names, we're going to ask you, as we have a practice of in the chat, to share the names of your justice seekers, people that inspire you to keep your work moving forward. And they don't always have to be historical folks, right? They can be people in our families, our chosen family, our friends, our communities, people that we've never met, but that give us the inspiration and the energy to keep going on. And so we have a few, the Combahee River Collective, which is instrumental in helping to shape what it means to have an intersectional analysis about our lives. Audre Lorde, Tema Okun, Winona LaDuke, Wilma Mankiller, Grace Lee Boggs, Sylvia Rivera, Marsha P. Johnson, Beta Caceres, Craig Govinder, and so many, many more. Yeah.
Yes,
we see the names.
People's Institute for Survival and Beyond.
Yes.
Bell Hooks. I can't read this.
Yes.
But it's incredible.
Octavia, Dean Spade, Asada, Tiffany, Vanessa, and Lucy, your partners, your
Kareem
nieces.
Burke.
Right, Ella Baker, Color of Change. Yes.
Octavia Butler,
is really doing something for us these days, right? Chimamanda, I saw her name go through all the new babies in the world, the abuelas and the mamas, right? And so, again, to those who may think, when are we going to get to it? This is getting to it. This is how we show up in a liberated stance so that we can be together. And for those of you who are trying to actually text not only the panelists or work in the chat with the panelists and the attendees, right next to where it says 2, there should be a drop-down box that says all panelists. And if you click on that drop-down, you can actually choose all panelists and attendees. So I know that question has come up for a few folks, and you can let us know how that's working if you need any more assistance. All right, we're gonna continue.
Yeah, and please keep it coming. I see Beyonce on this
Yes,
one.
Janet Mock.
Yes, Chris Sumner, right? Janet, yes. So thank you. I'm a dang, yes. We'll continue to do that as we also remember our community agreements, something that we never skip over, but we know that we're building common language and shared understanding. And so just to revisit these, we're going to ask everyone to commit to active listening, to be fully present and listen to each other, to silence our internal chatter and the conversations that can interrupt actually being able to hear one another. We're going to push through our growing edge and know that that growing edge can sometimes get us to freeze, and that we're going to keep moving through it, regardless of what comes up, to continue to push through that discomfort. That we understand there's no quick fix. Racism and oppression has been working very well for a long, long time, and we know that this is one of many of the ways that we are getting free. It's going to take time. And so we're going to ask you to trust the process. The process that we've been co-designing and building together, and that has been informed by legacies of phenomenal people doing incredible work. That we're always going to hold a frame of racism, and it's not an either or, but we're going to hold simultaneity, and that many things could be existing at the exact same time. And that talking about racism does not mean we are not talking about sexism. It does not mean we are not talking about heterosexism. And all the other forms of oppression. And that we're also going to remember that while we understand that people may come with good intentions, the beginning that we're going to start the conversation from a place of acknowledging the impact regardless of our intention. No matter how good our heart is and how much we care, doesn't necessarily keep us from causing harm. And so in these conversations and the conversations we encourage you to be having, we ask you to lead with acknowledging the impact regardless of your intention.
Yes.
And so let's talk about it. Let's talk about beyond single stories.
Yeah. So just to remind us, part of what we always want to keep in mind is the way that systems of oppression are doing these four things at any given time. And so if we're looking at having a liberatory practice about addressing systems, we actually have to know what we're up against. So systems of oppression, and can be racism, interconnected with homophobia, interconnected with heterosexism, is always looking to disconnect us from our source. And our source can be our people, how we connect to nature. For some people, it is your spiritual practice. For others, it's your purpose. And for some of us, it's all of those things. Sure. It's dissociating us from our bodies, right? So there's a historical narrative about who controls, whether or not we have control of our bodies, but also what happens when you don't have control? What happens when oppression actually triggers dissociation? It is distancing us from our emotions and distorting our stories, forcing us to have these narrow single stories. So we're always about restoring our stories, reconnecting to our source as we define it, reclaiming our bodies in the ways that we say work for us, and re-engaging our emotions among a spectrum, right? So it's not just one way to do it. So we always want to keep that in mind. And we suggest that you think about that, like after these calls and in between the week, that you start to notice what are the ways that systems of oppression are causing that to happen for you, and what are the ways that you're engaging or you're experiencing other people engaging in the liberatory practices around reconnection. Yeah.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. And so this whole concept of, beyond single stories and is really about looking at the complexities of our stories and how they have been narrowed down, or as we've been saying, stereotypes, or become stereotypes about who we are. We're familiar, many of us are familiar with what it means to have the burden of representation, to be one person who is to represent and embody all people of that group in so many ways, and that is just not possible. And it's actually dehumanizing and maintains oppression, maintains racism. And so those stories are incomplete, and they are they narrow our lives and the possibilities that we can actually live fully and wholly. And so these then become legalized. They can become institutionalized. So that way it becomes embedded into our policies, that we continue to reinforce single stories about people and peoples and their multiple identities. So our work is to look at then, so what is the actual impact of single stories? They can drain our individual and collective power, right? They perpetuate cycles of shame, blame, doubt, and invalidation. They can keep us answering irrelevant questions, like keeping us off focus, off target. They can justify quick fixes and our approaches to policies and programs, reinforce competition and distance, and maintain power and privilege and control. Some of the experiences that we have when we're being single stories, it feels like we're being gaslighted, right? Is there something going on around me? And I'm just is it only me? Right? So we can relate to those experiences of increasing our own doubt or self-doubt about who am I and who are my people? What is the story that I'm allowed to tell? And that it can interrupt how we take action. And so actually what I want to do is jump in a little bit to see if Nicole and Lorena, if you would share actually an example of how have you experienced being single-storied? How has that actually played out in your life that would help give context to what we're talking about today? Yeah, Lorena, please.
Yeah, I can start. I'm thinking a lot about what it meant to go to an all-white high school, and how, my parents had to work a lot, and my school was 30 minutes away from where I lived, and I had to be bused there. And so even the way I got to school was really different from the way most folks got there. Either they were being dropped off by their parents. So I had to get up really early and get on a bus, get on 2 buses. And I'm thinking about having report cards and having to sit in the room with my mom and translate what my teacher was saying, and how embarrassed I was that she didn't speak English well. And even when she tried and kind of did as best as she could, I was so embarrassed. I was I don't want to do this. Why do I have to translate? Why can't I be like the other kids? Why am I being dragged to report cards with my parent? And little things like that, where I was constantly feeling I wasn't I was like, had this like extra responsibility that I was really resentful about, and how as like a teenager I really acted out in probably really mean ways to my mom, and sort of didn't want her to be as involved as she probably wanted to be. And God, there's just so many things that when I see this list, even the first one, thinking about like my individual power and how the experiences that I've had interacting with like a really elitist education, I really lost that sense of power and felt really silenced in rooms where I was one of the only people of color, only women of color, and feeling like I didn't have power in those situations, and how that's translated even now in professional work around, is what I have to say important? And just really where that doubt starts to creep in, and getting really tied up in the energy that it takes to really sort of like find my way through all of that negative self-talk, and really preventing myself from actually being confident about the things that I know about myself, about my community, about my work, and how that is even like, I have to do many interventions for myself to kind of really get myself to feel grounded in the things that I know to be true, and how alienating it can feel, and like that disconnection, that sense of disassociating, or sort of being like, oh, this has nothing to do with me and I'm not going to participate, when actually I do have power in the situation, and how quickly I give that up. So yeah, those are some of the things that are coming up for me right now.
Yes, thank you so much. And you know, one of the things you're speaking to so beautifully is, you know, we'll often be, it's reinforced that like I am the problem, right? Or if I just have better self-esteem, and we create programs for self-esteem and, you know, self-love, but without necessarily analyzing. So what are those ideas of leadership? Who is a leader, and how that is not necessarily reflected in who I am, and that's not reinforced and supported in the same way as maybe white leadership, and how then we internalize that. So thank you for naming that so explicitly. Nicole, could you share a few examples?
Sure. Some of what I was thinking about is how, you know, again, thinking about being a very light-skinned and very fair, and how oftentimes people who are white assume I'm white, and that's my only identity. And so growing up in an urban setting, I had many people would say very stereotypical and hurtful things about my community to me, because they didn't know they didn't know my story, and they didn't ask me who my story. And so while I very strongly identified as a Native girl, as a Native woman, I was constantly hearing very negative narratives of what that means, right? And I was also hearing a lot of negative and hurtful jokes about Asian people and what it means to be Asian. So I was getting all of this and internalizing it, right? And then as I grew up, you know, and I was and when I would tell people I'm Native and Chinese, and people would say things to me like, oh, you must be able to really have a high alcohol tolerance then, or and so just the negative, the things that I began to internalize, right? Because it was the single story narrative that people had of Native people, that they felt very free and comfortable saying to me, because they didn't know who I was. And most people didn't really care to know. They thought I was exactly like them. And so they were comfortable in sharing that. And so, I mean, I think it's taken a long time to really process through all of that internalized stuff that you get. Like Lorena, I was listening to you talk about, you know, being embarrassed that your mom didn't, you know, speak English. And so how we start to like internalize the negative stuff that we get from other people, or maybe not being fitting in or the same, or, you know, what is that complexity?
That's right.
Absolutely. I think about some of the like single stories on that intersectional wave in terms of like, we think about the work that we're all doing to end gender-based violence, about like all of the questions that people get about what was she wearing, what kind of character, like that when Rachael was talking about, we have to spend so much time, energy, and focus on answering irrelevant questions as opposed to addressing harm. So the impact of single storying around all of our identities is super problematic, and actually shows up in our policies and the way that we actually approach solutions to people's lives. And we want to talk a little bit about how that's connected to implicit bias, right? And so if I just had a stereotype, first of all, stereotypes and single stories are being cultivated by our society, right? So every institution that we can think of is actually informing us. So oftentimes we talk about it's about who you're around. It's about your peer group, and your family should know better. It's about home training. It's partly that, but who is training people to take in these messages, right? Where are we being socialized as young as babies all the way into our elder years about who's worthy, who's a criminal, who's not a criminal, who's a leader, all of those things, how we see poverty, who's the face of poverty, right? And so underneath that are implicit biases, and we had a great video about that. So if you didn't get a chance to check it out in the pre-work, it really was a great way to kind of introduce the concept. But a few things that we want to say about why implicit bias is so crucial as part of racial equity work. One, we live in a world now that is like to identify itself as post-racial, right? And we also have, in the US in particular, very specific images and imagery around what acts of racism are. So it is lynchings, it is the KKK, it is these different acts of public violence that are happening, that happened 40, 50, 60 years ago. Now, some of these things we know are still happening now, but the idea and the images about what racism looks like are pretty antiquated, right? And so how do you actually unpack when racism is happening to people, even though we are all declaring that we're no longer racist, right? Because we have racism without racist. And so implicit bias has been an essential science that says we all have bias. We can actually measure bias, and the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity has done a lot of this work. So just these 3 or 4 things, everybody has it. None of us can escape it. It is pervasive. It is everywhere. Our implicit biases are often in direct contradiction to what our declared beliefs are and the stances that we would endorse publicly, right? So when we think about, I can actually do work as a straight woman and think that I consider myself in solidarity with LGBTQ communities and actually be engaging in implicit bias, right? Like not even have the conscious level that I'm engaging in microaggressions. And then if we're talking about racism in a race-constructed society, the spectrum, it's a spectrum. It's not a binary, but the spectrum, we're socialized to be pro-white and anti-Black, which pits us against each other across races, right? It pits white people against Black people, Indigenous folks against Latinx folks, API folks against everybody, right? So it is a spectrum, but really at the two ends we're socialized to see things as pro-white and anti-Black, and we're trying to figure things out in the middle. Yeah, sure. So we have a poll, if we could have that poll lifted up. So besides our families and our peer groups, like what are some of the mechanisms or the ways that you see, or entities that are contributing to implicit bias? Who's socializing us? So when that comes up, be sure to answer it, and we'll just kind of keep it moving while we're moving through. Anything you want to say about single stories? Yeah.
Well, and I want to connect, because I see some of the questions coming up in the chat box around distinctions between stereotyping and single stories, and we're really wanting to say we're looking at those as the same, right? Like that stereotypes are single stories about individuals that get applied to large communities or groups of people, and that single stories are the same thing. Really, this language of single stories is comes out of the work that Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie has done, a Nigerian author and writer. But the actual single storying is old and is historical and has been happening, and that and understanding that as problematic is not new. But this language around the danger of a single story comes out of a TED Talk that Chimamanda did a number of years ago. But it's also being able to look at, just as Monica said, with implicit bias, that second example, I believe it was, with how our values and morals can contradict our actual behavior. And so both being able to look at Chimamanda Adichie bringing forward really powerful and important work, and at the same time, as many of you I'm sure have heard, the controversial statement she's made that really was harmful to the trans communities, right? And looking at the ways in which she doesn't necessarily recognize her own implicit bias, even in doing important work. And so it's important for us to both lift up and give attribution to where some of this work is coming from, and how it doesn't mean that we are immune to causing harm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so please, we ask that you would, I think this poll is almost over, so we'll see what folks are talking about, right? So media having a huge influence, media, systems of education, and religion, really, they're so close. And if you listed something else, please put it in the chat about what your experience is about how our implicit bias is being reinforced. Yeah.
Yeah. So this frame that we use, our 3 goals.
There's 2 of us driving at the same time.
That's right. These goals that we're looking at around when we look at the frame of getting beyond the single story, that when we actually interrupt those single stories, we're able to strengthen and build our relationships, deepen our analysis in common language, and recenter our histories. And so what we want to do now, excuse me, is turn to Nicole and Lorena to help us give some context to what does that mean and what does that actually look like. And so specifically looking at relationships, wanting to know a little bit about what are some of the practices that you have engaged in getting beyond the single story that's helped to strengthen your relationship, whether that's relationship to self, family, as well as in your organizing and community work.
Yeah, I can
go
start.
ahead.
I'm thinking about the work that we do with young women, and you started talking a little bit, Rachel, about representation of leadership and what that looks like. So for us, a really core principle is that we see young women as leaders now for who they are, for their lived experience, as the tools that they have to engage with the world. And so sort of this model of, you don't have to wait to be a leader, you don't need to do X, Y, and Z, but that you're a leader now really sort of changes the framework and entry point for young women to see themselves. So we're really intentional about creating spaces and circles where young women can sit together and see themselves, and that the staff leadership looks like them and reflects really different ways of stepping into womanhood, of stepping into our own power and what we're really great at. And we have this really amazing annual healing retreat where young people are starting to explore, like, what is their own personal journey and where do they come from and what are the things that they're still discovering about themselves, and asking those questions that are about reflection and taking time to do that really intentionally so that young people can start stepping into vulnerability for the first time and sort of peeling away all those layers that we've had to, really use to protect ourselves and to survive. So I think about like the masks that we use when we're walking down the street or when we're walking into our classrooms or even walking into our own homes that may be unsafe. So really creating spaces that center their experiences as really valuable and taking the time to really unpack what that means with adults who are there as allies and guides, and using our own stories to be like, like, we're your mirrors right now. Like, how can we support each other in accessing these stories that sometimes our families aren't telling us or don't have the capacity to share in that same way. So yeah, and it really helps young people, especially like for teenagers, where this sense of judgment is really real for them, where they feel like schools is a really judgmental place, and now there's like, the internet as this place where there's like an added layer of perception and distortion. Really taking time to say, what does it mean to really hear other people for who they are and to ask questions and be curious and really work towards the inner self.
Yeah. Thank you. Nicole, would love to hear from you a little bit about how this practice, how you engage this practice as a way of strengthening your relationship.
Well, I think, I agree also listening to other people's stories. And I also think like being really intentional about the ways in which we do this work. And so, I think prior to working at the Minnesota Indian Women Sexual Assault Coalition, I didn't have as strong of a connection to the Native community. And so being really intentional about building sisterhood and listening to the stories of our other Native sisters can be a practice of bringing out our own stories, right? Because we're listening, we're connecting. And it was very intentional to disconnect us, right? Like the impact of colonization and assimilation was intentionally disconnected us from each other and from our stories. And so we don't always know that our stories are very connected, that we have similar stories to people in other communities, or even in communities, our own tribal communities, or, I can travel to California and listen to our Native sisters out there and have very similar experiences or stories where, you feel like you're family. And it was intentional for us to not have that. So I think that has been a really strong gift and a good practice for me to connect to my own story and to move beyond what is that singular story that maybe I held once, or maybe people have held about me.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, no, and there's some amazing things that y'all are sharing that are connected to like how it impacts our relationships, how it influences our analysis. I just want to share, some of you are talking about what it means to reground in the history of rural communities, what it means to reground in the history of Appalachia in particular, right? So the very negative, the very single stories about what happens in rural communities, about whether or not people's intelligence being connected to their region of the country or the region that they live in, all of these things. What does it mean to reclaim the beauty and the brilliance and the vibrancy of rural communities and lead from that? Many of you are talking about colonialism. So yes, and we want to acknowledge that racism is an extension of colonialism, right? It is just another way that it has morphed, so to speak. And then so many people talking about healthcare, the ways in which they're going into places that are supposed to provide care that are making all types of assumptions about whether or not you're pregnant, making assumptions about your sexuality, making assumptions about our gender, all of these things that are just reinforced, that are informed by implicit bias, but then are showing up very explicitly. So just wanted to kind of share what's happening, even if you can't see all of the chat. So thank you for the openness and the vulnerability at which everybody is sharing.
That's right. We often talk about tracking in terms of education, but in the healthcare system, there's tracking as well. Tracking people based on those assumptions for what kind of services they will or will not receive based on their age and all sorts of other things that Monica just named. So, the next one we're going to talk about common language, and really we can also connect this to centering history, because in order for us to build this shared common language, we have to understand history. And so we know that, present day, there are a lot of single stories that are being reinforced through practices, through programs, through policy. And so really would love for, Nicole, if there's anything you'd like to lift up around how do we see these single stories being institutionalized in various ways that are impacting the work that you're doing?
So I think, some of the stuff I was thinking about is how the narratives have negatively impacted like the services that Native women are receiving or the services that we're not receiving. And the narratives that are told about them when they walk in to receive services, right? And so we already have a framework about what it is that we think they need. Their, the deep involvement they are with social services and criminal justice systems, and being, labeled as, do you have an alcohol problem? Do you have this? Do you have that? Right. And so thinking about the practices that we have that set people up and already define for them what they need. And so, they're not always policies, right? Because oftentimes people know that those policies are not, we can't put that on paper, but we have a practice, right, of really pushing people into services we feel that they need based on what our narrative is and our story of who they are and what their experience is, without understanding without one even listening to the full extent of their story too, you know, and having any sort of understanding about historical trauma and the impact of historical trauma. So one of the things that we seen when we did our interviews with Native women who were used in prostitution and trafficking was a vast majority of them were diagnosed with PTSD and bipolar and depression. And so they had all these diagnoses, and they were highly medicated because of it, right? And so, but nobody was really talking to them about the impact of trauma, right? So they had all these labels, and they had all these, you know, multiple of diagnoses, but nobody was really doing any work with them on the impact of trauma. It was like, oh, well, you must be XYZ. And so really looking at, you know, when we talk about healthcare and different things about how that negatively impacts, because that's a label that they're carrying, right? And it follows you every time you go somewhere else for services. Those labels are following. And so not necessarily policies, but definitely practices that are.
Absolutely.
And what some of folks are saying in the chat is that, and then the added layer of having to advocate for self is also exhausting, right? And then where are we in terms of willingness, capacity, and understanding to even advocate for self? And lots of sharing around DV programs and healthcare. So just want to just uplift and reinforce that people are affirming what the stories that you all are sharing. Yeah. And that trauma, like when we think about the historical trauma, it's also happening right now, right? That tribal communities are under occupation in this moment, right? That it is not like we have not decolonized the United States yet. So it's what's happened in the past that's being carried forward for many generations, but also what is happening to communities constantly. What is the trauma of being of poverty? Poverty can generate trauma. Like so many of these things are connected. So that's why it's crucial that we have some analysis that doesn't reinforce the single stories. And because the setup is that, in particular, a big single story that we see now is around, in this political moment, around like who's valuable in terms of the electorate, right? And so that we didn't focus on somehow that we don't have an analysis of what's happening to all poor people, regardless of race. Like we actually don't have that collectively. And so there's a disconnect that what is happening, what poor white people are not receiving is because poor people of color are receiving all of these benefits. And that's actually a single story. What would it look like if we were organizing interracially with an intersectional and multiracially, with an intersectional analysis of class? What is happening to working people in the U.S. in particular? What is happening to poor people living, just trying to make ends meet, that we could come up with some ways to address that, knowing that each situation is not the same, but again, the setup is that you are the cause of my oppression. So I have a single story about this community and nobody looks at this community story. So it's really crucial to have some context.
Right. Lorena, would love to have you share if there's again, the way that you're seeing this show up in the work that you're doing, just to take a minute and just share an example of how you see it showing up present day. And really what we're speaking to is how does the practice of storytelling and being able to tell multiple stories interrupt violence? And so what are those single stories that we are interrupting that show up present day in the work you're doing with the young folks you're organizing?
Yeah, and I think Nicole really started this thought around, we're not asking young women what they need, right? We're sort of making assumptions about the things that they, that they may not necessarily see as for themselves in that moment. So I'm thinking about what happens a lot for my young women around erasing mental health issues, when young women are reaching out to counselors in their school and they're saying like, hey, I'm experiencing depression, or I'm really sad, and sort of how that gets overlooked. But it's like, oh, but you have good grades and your SAT scores are high, so why are you sad? Like this questioning of like, what's wrong with you? Like, you don't really need this. You need to focus on your studies. Or it happens in our own communities where we're like, just go to church, just pray about it. This is just like a phase you're going through. So just like even the language that we use that really invalidates the experience of young people. And when they are actually asking for support, how quick adults are to diminish that. And how damaging that is, right? And so, for that, even coming to a counselor was already a big step. And if they feel shut down, they may not talk to another adult about that. So I'm thinking a lot about when young women are actually asking for support, what it looks like and feels like to be shut down, or when they're asking questions about how to have safe sex, and it's like, why are you asking me about that? Like, why are you having sex in the first place? And it's like, it just drives me insane, because I'm like, oh man, like this is a learning opportunity, and so many lack of resources around supporting young women and all the things that they are curious about, and sort of not nurturing that sense of asking conversations and advocating for themselves. Like, no, actually, I don't want to do that. Like, I need support in this way. And when we're not asking those questions, we're really missing those opportunities.
That's right. You know, what both of you are just, thank you so much for everything that you've just shared. It's just so powerful. And I want to lift up two quick things as we talk about centering history. You know, one, recognizing that, you know, every social service program and institution was set up specifically to benefit people in power, and understanding that people in power meant white upper class people. And so if we remember that, then when we look at the way in which our institutions are providing services, if we're not mindful of the single story and the implicit bias, we will continue to perpetuate that we are trying to serve those who are in power, even if they are not asking for it. Right? And so I'm even thinking about the single story around health services. Who do we promote health services, mental health services for, and who has had historically very traumatic and devastating relationships with medical services. So whether we look at forced sterilization, whether we look at the ways in which that has shown up historically, when we see our resistance if we're, to getting those services, if we don't understand that history, then we don't understand, well, why don't people ask for help? Why don't people come to our for our medical programs and receive these free, wonderful resources? Well, there hasn't necessarily been a successful history of that working in our favor.
Yes, so we have a few more minutes, and just, again, wanting to acknowledge the richness of the conversation that's happening, and also just to remind us to breathe. If you can hydrate, drink water as we're doing this, because as we're talking about it, we are not separate from this, right? So that's why we ground in the beginning, and we are conscious of our breathing, and we're sending lots of healing, love, and light and energy to everybody, all of us who have been impacted by the trauma of single stories. And so even as we close the call, to reach out to your own community or people that you feel safe with, if anything comes up for you, to engage your body in whatever way works for you, again, recognizing we are on a spectrum around the ability to journal, whatever it is, and also to use art. We're artists, so if it's doodling, drawing, listening to music, any of those things are super crucial as we deepen into these stories, right? More will come up as we're moving forward. Yes, please.
So just want to take another 30 seconds, right? So just thinking about in terms of when you are continuing to do this work to interrupt these single stories, I want to ask you, what are the stories of empowerment, or what is a story of empowerment or a source of inspiration that you draw upon that helps you to continue to interrupt these single stories, to continue to work, to work with your folks, with your people, to keep going?
Yeah, I think for me, I always ask the young people I work with in circles, what is something people wouldn't know about you just by looking at you? And I get so many interesting stories, and it's sort of amazing, like what is possible when you take the time to actually look deeper, right? And I think for young people, young women who are constantly being judged and labeled about how they look, about how the spaces they occupy, how they show up, how loud they are, to be like, who are you outside of what people see? And I think that's like a really great strategy for me to get to those stories. And then when we ask people, like, what is it that you want to change about your community? What do you want to see happen? And all of these great ideas around just really changing their landscape and the conversation. And it's really exciting to give them 10 minutes to create a product that would make their lives better. And they're thinking about things like gentrification and ending sort of the stigma around teen pregnancy and making sure that they have access to all of these different resources. So it's always really exciting for me to see young women name those things for themselves and to really listen to what they have to say.
Beautiful. Thank you, Lorena. Nicole, just a little bit, give us source of inspiration?
So for me, a source of inspiration is that I'm here. Like, I've survived genocide, right? Like my grandfather,
Right.
Yes.
my mother was, raised in a very different world, and I have my Indian name. My kids have their Indian name. My grandson will have his Indian name. And so we have survived the genocidal practices, and we are still here, and we get to pass that on. And we get to continue growing that. And we get to continue changing that single story of who we are and who our people are. And that's what really inspires me to keep going.
Thank you.
Yes. Affirmed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, y'all. Yes.
So in closing, just beautiful way for us to end. Thank you, Nicole and Lorena, for all that you've offered us today, your stories. And what we want to ask you all to do is to tune in to the single stories that are all around us, whether they're happening in our families, with our friends, at work, in the media. Just tune in to where are those single stories happening. What are the implicit biases that are embedded in those stories, and how is harm being perpetuated? Really want to encourage us to spend more time analyzing and becoming in tune with when those are showing up, and that's how we will strengthen interrupting them.
Yeah. And for all of you asking, I'm just still sitting with Nicole's statement. I have survived genocide, right? And so if that is not inspiration and like just depth and power, I feel so strengthened and empowered by what you said, and so moved, and the presence of what it means to survive genocide, right? And so thank you for declaring that and reminding us. And we know that there are other folks on this call from across the globe who have also survived genocide. And so just wanting to pause right there on that and let folks know that this work is available to you. You'll get the slides, you'll get a link to the recording. You can always go back, you can share with your folks. And if you have questions, we'll be taking those too. But just thank you for the openness that Nicole and Lorena have given to us, but also those of you in our community. We know it went way too fast, but we're also just trying to practice very lightly and then go back and practice in our community. So be well, be strong, be liberated, people. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. We're still in the chat watching. So Rachel, so what we generally have done, for those of you who are still on, what song reminds you, any song, what reminds you of like your, what's a source of inspiration and empowerment for you, whether it's a song, a story, a piece of art?
Well, I always use, oldies songs are always can shift anything. So oldies, Motown, put on some, Temptations or little Diana Ross if I need to strut around, absolutely.
Yeah. So today's outro song may be hard to hear, but it's India Ari's video, right? That we are beyond these single stories, right? And we are more than how people see us. So if you want to listen to something, think about your art and your music, but today we're going to close out with India Ari video. All right.
Sometimes I shave my legs and sometimes I don't. Sometimes I comb my hair and sometimes I won't. Then I'll have the wind blow the mighty cane toe. Whatever feels good in my soul. Savage girl in the video.
Yes, everybody. Have a great week, everybody. We'll see you next week. Yes.